Okay. So we're going to talk about quite a few things about an object. Those last three things, the for in loop, the keys, and the nested objects, are primarily what a lot of our workshops are going to be focused on. So I'll definitely slow down there and make sure that everyone is all caught up. So at a high level, what is an object? The short answer is an unordered collection of key value pairs. In JavaScript, we call objects. In Python, we call them dictionaries, or dicts for short, DICTS. And I actually really like the visual image of a dictionary, right? Because one way to think about how we would describe a dictionary is that it's a collection of words and their definitions. That's exactly what an object is, right? When we say an object is a collection of key value pairs, the keys are just the words and the values are just the definitions. And so, like arrays, objects can also store values. But now, if you think about a dictionary, if I want you to look up a word for me, I don't say look up the 1260th word in the dictionary. I would say look up the definition for the word apple, for example, right? So with an array, if you remember, we always used to say, well, give me the third thing in the array, give me the fifth thing, give me the last thing, right? Give me the nth thing. And when in a way that made sure that in arrays the orders of the items mattered, right? In a dictionary, they don't really order as much because we don't use it by trying to look up the the 10th word or the nth word, right? We say, well, assuming the dictionary is alphabetical, we say, hey, give me this word. And when we look it up by that word. That word in arrays is called indices. Here in objects, it's called keys. And so if I do a quick comparison here, on line 6, we have our typical typical array with two elements. The first element is value 1. The second element is value 2. If I was to do an object that also contains value 1 and value 2, well, now because I no longer have this idea of first and second, I need to say value 1 is tied to something called key 1, and value 2 is tied to something called key 2. And if I print out my array, the first thing, right, index 0, or my object, I use the same bracket notation I do for arrays, except now instead of passing in a number denoting the position, I can now pass in a string that denotes the key. Well, both of them are going to lead me to value 1, except in line 13, I kind of need to go into it knowing that value 1 is the first element in my array. And in line 14, I go into it knowing that that value 1 is tied to the key 1. So that's pretty much like the fundamentals of an object, right? Is that it's just a collection of keys and values, or words and their definitions, if you want to use that analogy. Syntactically, we use the same curly braces that we use to create scope, so just be careful there that you don't confuse those two. And then the other thing is, notice how in between every key and value, we have a colon. So everything to the left of the colon is the key. Everything to the right of the colon is the value until you reach that comma at the end of line 9 there. That's how we separate key value pairs, right? So line 9 ends in a comma, and therefore the next key value pair starts. A question here, so let me just pull it up. Can you have identical keys? Yep, we're going to talk about that, but the short answer is no. Just like how you can't have multiple words, sorry, you can't have the same word more than once in a dictionary. You also cannot have more than one key in an object, and we'll talk about what happens when that collision does occur. Okay, so why are objects useful? If I give you something like that on line 2, and it's an array with Pusheen, 7, and Gray and Tabby, you have a lot of data there, but it's intuitively not very clear what those things mean, right? Is Pusheen a name? Is it a breed? Is it, a location? What is it? And so you don't really quite know, right? However, if we were to use something like an object to store the same values, now we can actually associate each value with a key, and usually the key is something that describes the value, and then the value is what the actual value is. And so on line 2, I'm trying to describe a cat, and I give you an array of 3 things. But someone could read that and not really know what those three data points mean. However, when I look at line 10 there, sorry, when I look at line 10 there and I create the object, now instead of just having Pusheen, 7, and Gray and Tabby, I associate each one of those values with a key. So Pusheen is the name, age or 7 is the age, and Gray and Tabby is the color. And now when I look at the object, the values hopefully have a little bit more context behind it, right? I kind of have a better sense of what I'm looking at. And notice once again, we still have a colon between each key value pair, and each key value pair also ends in a comma to denote that that's the end of that key value pair and the start of the next key value pair. Type of object is an object. So that's hopefully pretty straightforward here. Just something to be aware of. Although just you want to be careful when you do this because as we saw yesterday, when you use an array, that is also an object under the hood by JavaScript standards. Okay, so creating an object. This is pretty much the same thing as knowing the basic syntax of the objects that we've seen so far. The only difference here is notice how now on line 7, 8, and 9, the keys no longer have quotes around them, right? In fact, they look like variables, right? Name, that doesn't look like a string anymore. But in reality, that is still a string because, and this is a hard and fast rule in JavaScript, the keys of an object in JavaScript are always strings. And so because of that restriction, when you make the key an object, you are able to actually not write the quotation marks because JavaScript is essentially going to cast that or coerce that into a string for you whenever it uses or reads or whatever, whenever it does anything with the object. And so once again, because an object's keys always have to be strings, in that case, what you do is you can actually just not write the quotes around it. JavaScript is going to convert that into a string no matter what you do. Now, if you choose to still keep the strings in there, there's absolutely nothing wrong and JavaScript will still work properly. But the probably bigger takeaway here is just that also means you can't use anything else as the key of a variable. So you can't use a number or a Boolean, or another array or whatever it is to be the key. The key has to be a string. Okay. Accessing the values of an object is pretty straightforward. It looks just like, or rather, we use the same bracket notation that we use to access values in an array, except now instead of passing a numerical index indicating position, we now pass in a string indicating kind of which key that we want to look at in the object. And so here, when I do Pusheen name, age, and color, as well as that very last thing on line 14, if I use a fake key, or basically not a fake key, but if I use a string that doesn't exist as a key in the object, I get, well, so for the first three, I get the proper values, but on the last one, I get an undefined. And once again, this is very much in parallel with what we saw with arrays, right? Where if I have an array of 4 things and I tell it, hey, give me your 5th element, JavaScript doesn't throw an error. JavaScript just says, well, right now the 5th element is undefined. Here, same exact thing. If I try to access the key for a value that does exist, JavaScript will give me the value. But if I use a key that does not exist, JavaScript doesn't error out. It just says, oh, it could exist, but right now it's undefined. So just be careful of that too, right? You could theoretically, successfully run code where you're using a key that doesn't exist if JavaScript, or if you don't kind of set any checks to make sure that what you get back is actually a defined value instead of undefined. One thing to note here is in the last example, we talked about passing a name as a string as a key. But we can also pass in any variables or expressions. So the main thing to note here is on line 12, key to check is not a string, it's a variable. And so when we use it to access the key in an object, what JavaScript is going to do is JavaScript is going to first convert that key to check. It's going to say, oh, you're a variable. What variable are you kind of? And we'll talk about this convention more on Thursday. But JavaScript essentially asks which value are you pointing to, right? Which value does key to check variable represent? It goes up to line 10, finds out it's the string name, and then it will access the name key in Pushing. Similarly, on line 13 there, we can actually pass in a string directly, right? And that can also take the form of an expression. The order of operation indicates that JavaScript will solve whatever is in between those two brackets first before it tries to access that key, right? So on line 13 there, it will concatenate col plus or first to get the string color before it then accesses a color key on Pushing, which gives us gray and tabby. One thing to note here is you might also see people do the same exact thing we just saw, but do it a different way. There is something called the dot notation in JavaScript, and a lot of people use that to access the object because it looks a little bit cleaner. What the dot notation does is it does the same exact thing as the bracket notation, right? Except the one major difference here is, whereas if in my previous example, here I could pass in either a variable or a string into the brackets to access a particular key. Under dot notation, I can't pass in a variable anymore. I can only pass in the actual string value of the key. And so because I can only pass in the string value, much like the earlier slide when we talked about how when you create a key in an object, sometimes you'll need to put quotes down because JavaScript knows it has to be a string. That same principle applies here. Here on line 11, when I access Pushing.name, .name is literally going to be .name, right? It's going to be the string name, and that's going to be the name of the key that it looks for. .name means I'm not looking for a variable called name. I am literally looking for a key with a string value of NAME. In fact, on line 14 there, if you notice how on line 9 I create a variable called key to check and I set it equal to name. On line 14, I then do pushing.key to check. Well, if you look at the last line of the printout there on the top right hand corner of your screen, you'll see that we get undefined. And the reason for that is because, once again, remember, with dot notation, we cannot use variables. Whatever comes after the dot has to be the exact string value of the key. And so on line 14, when we do pushing.key to check, we're not looking for a variable called key to check. We are looking for a key, literally called KEYTOCHECK. And when we look in the Pushing object on lines 3 through 7 there, we'll see that the key to check key does not exist. And so once again, when you try to access a key that does not exist, JavaScript just says, okay, the value is undefined, as in it might exist later, but for now you haven't really told me what it's going to be yet. Okay, so this is a very common mistake that people use when they want to use dot notation. Is sometimes they try to pass in the actual name of the key, which works perfectly. Other times they try to pass in variables, which understandably backfires. And so whenever you use dot notation, it just means you have to know exactly which key you're looking for. You cannot use variables to represent it. Okay, if you want to use variables to access a key, go back to the bracket notation that we had discussed earlier. Okay, any questions so far? Let's get so. All right, adding a key value pair, pretty simple, right? Earlier we saw how to read it. Now to add it or to replace it, you just literally put an assignment operator, right? We do the equal sign, and then we set that key equal to whatever it is value that we want to, right? You can do this with both bracket and also with dot notation. Someone asked earlier, what happens if we have multiple keys what happens if we have identical keys in an object? So here, what if on line 12 I did pushing.name equals David? Well, when JavaScript reads the code, if it comes across a key that already exists, it will just override the previous value with the new value, right? So in every object, you can be guaranteed that there's only going to be a single version of each key. And so that also just means be very careful when you write in values, especially if you want to make sure that you're not overwriting a previously existing value. In fact, that's a very common pattern you'll see in a lot of code when you're dealing with objects is people will usually check to see if the value already exists for a given key before they write it. If it does exist, they might save it somewhere. They might make a copy of it or just know that it's there. But that's why you want to be careful. You're not just kind of blindly overwriting whatever key you want, and just so you don't lose any previous data. Yep. So here we added two more keys, one called sister, one called brother, and we see the values there. And then changing a value is what we just talked about, right? You use the equal sign to override a previously existing value. On line 10 there, pushing.age++, that also works as well. Basically, once you have access to the value, you can do whatever you want to it. You can treat it basically as if you had access to that value, right? So pushing.age gives you 7, and then plus plus is going to give you, we set age to 8 on line 9 there, so pushing.age on line 10 is going to give you back 8, and then plus plus is just saying, hey, let's set pushing.age equal to pushing.age plus 1, so that gives you 9. Yep, see it. Go ahead.
For line 9, can you also do the bracket notation with plus plus?
Line 9, can we do the bracket notation? Yep, you absolutely could. Yeah. Yeah. And then so someone just asked a question around the order of the keys. We'll actually talk about that when we talk about the for in loop. But the short answer is the order of the keys should not matter in JavaScript if you're using a key. Sorry, I'm already sharing my screen, right, everyone? Okay, this is strange. All right, this is strange. Okay, whatever. Okay, so yeah, so changing a value. So I will come back to this idea of ordering in objects in 3 more slides, I believe. Okay, so you can also use a delete keyword to delete a key value pair in JavaScript. Delete is another reserved word in JavaScript, which means it has special meaning as part of the language. You can't build a variable called delete, and JavaScript won't let you do that. So when you do something like line 9, when you say delete pushing, key age, that will delete both the key and the value. This is something you actually don't see very often, at least I haven't seen very often yet in kind of live programming. And the reason why is because if you go back to our analogy of a dictionary, you wouldn't go to a dictionary and delete the words you don't like or you don't use, right? Like you just leave it there so that in some case in the future, either you might need it or someone else might need it. So in an object, usually it makes a lot more sense to just ignore what you don't need or what you don't use, rather than go through the trouble of actually deleting it. The most common reason why people would delete something from an object is obviously for security reasons. So if I give you an object of your name, email, and password, well, before I give the object to someone else, I might say, hey, let's delete the password key value pair, and someone might just need your name and your email. That's it, right? I don't want them to see your password. So you usually do that more for security reasons. In general, there's not really much of a need to delete key value pairs just for common usage. You just ignore what you don't need. Okay, so that pretty much sums up the parts of the object that hopefully is a little bit more kind of basic, and the hope is some of it is review. And also a lot of it looks very much like what we did with arrays. So hopefully there's like kind of multiple layers of familiarity there. The next 3 things we're going to talk about are probably going to be new. And they all deal with kind of how we actually want to use and go through objects, much like how we kind of wanted to use and go through arrays yesterday. So the first thing we'll talk about is the in operator. And the in operator by itself is actually very, very simple here. All it does is if I give you the name of a key, if I say name in Pusheen or sadness in Pusheen, that basically just asks, hey, does this key exist in this object? And as hopefully the way I phrase that question makes it clear, there's only 2 possible answers. It's either yes or no, right? Either the key is in the object or it's not. There's no other possible values. So you know that whenever you use an in operator, you are by definition always going to get back a Boolean value, right? So that's all the in operator does, is it just tells you if the key exists in an object. Now, where it gets a little bit more complex is, what if we actually try using the in operator and we join it with our for operator? And that kind of leads to this thing what we call a for in loop. So so on line 3 through 7 there, right? I have this object, I have 3 keys and 3 corresponding values. The question becomes, well, how do I actually read through that object, right? How do I go through and try to figure out what everything is? If I gave you an array and I said, hey, can you go through this array for me? Well, we go back to our handy for loop and we start with our index at 0 and we go through every single index in the array. In an object, there's not really this idea of length, right? And to Tom's question from earlier, there's also not this idea of order because in an object, theoretically, the order shouldn't matter. Everything kind of exists on the same level, right? Like you wouldn't use an object and say, well, name comes before age because really it's like there is no order, right? It's just Pusheen is a thing. It has a name characteristic. It has an age characteristic. It has a color characteristic, right? There's nothing that indicates which one, quote unquote, came first. And so the way we iterate then through an object is a little bit different than the way we iterate through an array. And we do it by using this for in loop. The basic syntax of it is there on line 9, right? Like lines 10 through 11 looks just like everything else that we've seen. The only main difference is on line 9, and we still see our for operator, except now we're passing in essentially not really a conditional, but we're passing in an in operation in between those conditionals. Just so you know, actually let me write this out for you in REPL so you can actually see a little bit more clearly. Hopefully the color coding makes it just slightly more easy to understand. But if I do something like for, I do let, let's say David in OBJ, right? The let and the in, notice how they're highlighted in blue. Let me zoom in here. Okay. Notice how the let and the in are highlighted in blue. That just means bar and then hello world. Okay. So the let is basically creating a variable, much like how I did a normal for loop. Remember how we had this guy, let I equals 0. That's exactly what this same let is, right? We're starting with saying, hey, let's create this temporary placeholder variable. In this case, it's called David. In, which is the in operator we just learned, notice how it's a different color, right? Because it's a built-in operator. And then we go through the object we actually want to take a look at. In this case, obj. And here, if I just do console.log out, I'll say David colon, I'll do David. And right beneath it, I'll do obj David. Now when I run this, actually one thing that I like to do, especially when I'm printing out loops, just to make it a little bit more easily readable, is I put some asterisks in the middle there. So when I read it, I can see where the breaks are, right? So here, when I go through this now, when I use this for loop, what this for in loop is actually doing is it's actually going to go through every single key in OBJ. And for every single key, I now have access to it, right? Much like how when we iterate through an array, we have access to every single index at a certain point. Here, we have access to every single key at a certain point. And if I give you a dictionary and I give you all the words, in this case, I give you an object and I give you all the keys, then through doing the object, through doing this, well, you now also have access to every single value in JavaScript. Because we have to assume in JavaScript objects that order does not matter, this function lets you go through every single key, but you can't really guarantee yourself, oh, I'm always going to get name first, or in this case, I'm always going to get foo first, then hello, right? Just don't make that assumption. And if you're working with something that really, really requires order, then it actually means you should probably be using an array instead of an object. Because typically speaking, when you use objects, the order should not matter. If it does, then you should be using another data type to represent that information. Okay. The other common question that people get asked, or that I've gotten asked here, is, well, what if I only want to go through half the object or some other parts of the object? Well, the answer then becomes, well, you probably shouldn't be using this using the for loop, right? The for loop is built by default to go through every single key in the object. And so if you only want to go through a certain portion of it, there are other ways to do so, which I'll show you in the following slide. But the for loop, by definition, goes through every single key, so you cannot pick and choose which keys you want to go through. Like you can do, like in a for loop, you can say, give me every other key. You can't really do that here with the for loop. You can use a body of the code to skip the keys you don't like, but that doesn't mean that the for loop does not still go through them. Okay. The other thing I'll just say here, and when you do the workshops, it will probably become a little bit more painfully clear, is just know that this David here, this is only the key. Okay. This, whatever that we create here, this will only ever represent the key. The value needs to be the object, and you provided the index of the key, or you use bracket notation to say object bracket key. That gives you the value. This variable here, this is not the value. This is just the key. This is the value. This is just the word. This is the actual definition for the word. When you do the workshops, I see so many will get tripped up here. So at every single instance in your code, make sure you know exactly what you're looking at, whether you're looking at the object, the key, or the value, because all three are very, very different things. Any questions here? Yeah, great question. So for in checks only the keys. We'll cover something next slide that tells you what the values are. Yeah, but for in only iterates through the keys.
Two things.
Yeah,
I
sure.
don't fully understand exactly what the for loop is used for.
Yep.
And then if we could also just go through one other example to show how that's actually used. What is the first part?
Okay. Sure. Let me just have another example here. I'll say student one. Um, okay, great. So this will be Michael, and this will be Gabriella. This will be student 3. This will be student 2. Okay, and then I'll come all the way down here so we can't see that object anymore, right? And so here, let's say we're create a function called roll call, and you pass in a class. And all this does here is just copy this code. Okay, great. So all the roll call function does is it goes through and it says for let student in class print out student number, and then here let's do student name. Oh, nope, sorry, that's wrong. This is just student. Oh wait, I should not be using class. I'll do classroom. Because notice how earlier when I did class, it was a blue. That's because class is a reserved word in JavaScript, and I definitely do not want to do that. Okay. Great. So I'm purposely hiding the class up there, okay? Classroom student. Okay, great. So let's say I have this function, right? And basically, if I represent my class as an object, and I have a list of students and their names, and I actually want to kind of, whenever I give someone this class, I want someone to kind of call out for me. All right, this is student one. This is their name. Okay. If I have this function here, and if I didn't have this for loop, right? Let's say this didn't exist. Let's say I delete it right now. If I gave you an object, what way do you have of going through every single key and value in that object if you don't know what the keys are that already exist, right? Like you're this little function, someone just comes in and says, hey, here's an object, here's a classroom. And you say, great, let me call everyone's name. Oh my God, I don't actually know which keys exist in that object. So what do? Right? With an array, we know that, well, every array has at least a first position, a second position, and so on and so forth, right? So we can start saying, well, let's just start from the beginning of the list and work our way down, right? With the positions, with the indexes. With an object, we don't really have that luxury, right? Because there's no sense of order. And so if I give you an object and you don't know what's in this object, you really have no possible way of using it, right? You're basically kind of stuck just guessing random keys and hoping that some of them match. And that's kind of a preposterous way to use an object. And so what the for loop does that's really helpful is now it says, hey, look, you don't need to know what's in this classroom, but the for loop will say, I will go through every single key in this object for you. And so if I didn't know what was in there before, I didn't actually run anything. That's silly. Now when what did I call obj? Now when I actually run it, it will actually go through and it will print out everything for me in this object. And so that's kind of the value of this for loop is that with an array, we know we can always start at position 0 and work our way down. With an object, if we don't know anything about the object, about what keys are in it, we by default don't really have a place to start, and the for loop kind of helps us get around that. Does that answer your question? Both of them? Great, awesome. I think there's one other question. Well, obj is the argument, right? I pass obj into my roll call function, and then when I'm inside the roll call function, obj becomes classroom, right? So I just use classroom here. Remember, functions are meant to be self-contained, except for whatever it is you explicitly pass in. Right? And I can't really use obj inside my function because what if now I have something called, hey, obj2, right? I have another classroom, right? And this is, let's say, this is a Dexter, and this is Ben, right? And this is Gabe. Well, if I was using obj in my roll call function, my function could only work for obj. Now it can work for whatever class I want because now I can pass in obj2 and then da, right? So everything inside the function should always be self-contained. And the only thing that should be different is whatever you pass into it. Cool. All right. So going back to this, we have only 2 more slides, I believe, just to wrap this up. So this is the for loop. Yep, this will loop through every single thing. Yeah, so just make sure that when you use a for loop, you really can't use dot notation anymore because remember, dot notation basically says you have to know exactly what the key is. And if that example there on line 10, if you use, or on line 9, if you use like key and pushing, and you do pushing.key, JavaScript's not gonna recognize that you're trying to use a variable. It will think you're trying to access a key, literally called key, key, and it's not gonna find it. So therefore, it's gonna give you back an undefined value if you look at the printouts. So whenever you use a for loop, you almost always have to use the bracket notation. Okay, the last 2 things that can maybe be a little bit handy. One of which is someone asked, well, what if I just want to take a look at all the keys or all the values? Well, now we can make use of our handy object class, just like our array class and our number and everything else, all the other data types that we've covered. If I do an object.keys, so if I delete these 2 for now, if I just do object.keys and I pass in obj, that's going to give me back very nicely an array. And in this array, it's going to have a list of all of the keys. Okay. Once again, don't read too much into the order of the array because it may not always be consistent. But just know that this is a way for you to get access to every single key in the object. And then if I do object.values, I literally get back a list of all of the values. I literally get back a list of all of the values in the array. Okay, Once again, don't read too much into the order, but now I'm looking at only the values. Um, I would not make a habit of calling these two side by side in order to see what's in an object and assume that the first key matches to the same object, to the first object, or the second key matches to the second object, etc. That's not what this is meant to be used for, and it may not always be consistent. So you should do this kind of more as kind of like, oh, I need an array of keys to do something else, and not as a way to read the object. If you need to read if you need to read the audio, if you need to read the object, just use a for and loop. Cool. All right, and the very last slide. Oh, I guess we have maybe one or two more. The very last slide is on nested. Sorry, this is a rehash of nested arrays that we talked about yesterday, right? So object values can be anything, including arrays. And this is just to drive home the point that if you remember yesterday at the end of the class, we talked about how nested arrays work, right? How if I have an array inside another array, I can do array bracket notation followed by another bracket notation in order for me to access the inner array. Well, objects work in the same exact way. Here on line 10, can do pusheen, and here I do dot colors. I could use bracket notation and put colors in a string and put in between the brackets, and then I follow that up with an index 0 or an index 1. All this says is, hey, go to the pusheen object. Great. Now go to the colors key and get the value for colors. Got it. Now go to the zeroth or the first position, or the zeros or first index for whatever value you get for colors, and we can do that. So this is just another application of us being able to chain together multiple operations when we go through an object. And last but not least, just like how arrays can hold other arrays, objects can easily hold other objects. Obviously, only as the values, because once again, every string in a JavaScript object, sorry, every key in a JavaScript object has to be a string, but the values can be whatever it is you want it to be, including other objects. And so there's really no limits to the level of nesting that you can use when you're creating an object. And that is pretty much it. So sorry, on line 13 there, you see us actually use dot notation to traverse through, and we could easily be using bracket notation there as well. With the way that JavaScript would actually evaluate something like line 13 or 14 is it would just start from left to right, and it will keep doing what you tell it to do until at some point it fails. So it's actually pretty resilient in that way. It won't try to like pre-check. It'll just try to do it, and if it fails, it fails. So yeah, so that's a recap of everything we've talked about with objects. Hopefully the first 4 or 5 things are pretty straightforward. And I think with the for and loop is kind of where things get a little bit tricky, and I guess just to kind of make it a little bit more painful for you, that is what most of the workshop is going to be on. We're gonna try to kind of push you to be able to use an object and go through it and do something with it. But yeah, any questions on objects before I pair you off into the workshop?